What's up YouTube? I've got an exciting bike to talk about today. This is the bike I bought for $1,000 and raced the Sea Otter downhill on. If you haven't checked out those videos, I would recommend giving them a watch. In this video, I'm going to do a bit more of a technical breakdown on the bike. It's a 2011 Ibis Mojo HD and talk about how a 26-inch trail bike compares against the modern crop of super bikes that are out there with over 10 years of development since this thing was released. So let's get into it. Now, despite this being completely outdated, having small wheels, having absurdly small geometry compared to what we're used to nowadays, I was actually able to ride this bike at a fairly high level. And I'll break that down in greater detail towards the end of the video, but I had a pretty hectic race run on this thing and still put down a semi-respectable time. Now, the Sea Otter downhill is a very specific track that maybe wouldn't expose a lot of this bike's weaknesses, but there's, some lessons to be learned from going back and riding the older stuff that people were going absurdly fast on about 10 years ago. I think a good place to start is the geometry. So reach numbers are kind of a more recent thing that have gotten the majority of attention with bike geometry, but back then they didn't even publish reach numbers. So what we have to work with is a wheelbase number. This is a size medium, so this is small for me even back in the day. I'm 6'1", but it's especially small now. So on the medium, the wheelbase is 1,122 millimeters, while modern bikes are easily reaching into the high 1200s, even 1300 mil wheelbases. So that is a massive change. It's got a 66-degree head angle and a 435 mil chainstay. It is worth noting that this is a 26-inch rear wheel and a 27.5-inch front wheel, so kind of a mid-school mullet, so that may affect the geometry a little bit. So those are the geometry numbers, but what does that mean for how it rides on the trail? The biggest thing is that the thing turns on a dime. Like, I was able to kind of just inside corners, flick it around, and you kind of like think of something and it happens. But that also kind of translates into a much twitchier ride experience. But overall, like, the threshold of the bike is still high. It's just less comfortable to operate at those higher speeds because there's less of a safety blanket with that wheelbase and that slack head angle. So the point at which you start to get thrown over the front of the bike is much closer to your neutral riding position. And kind of the same with the rear. It's easy to get like way far off the back, which is actually kind of nice in some situations, but the big problem when it comes to confidence is the front end deal. And if something happens or you get hung up, it's easy to get your weight way too far forward and then go into a big endo. On modern bikes, there's so much more room in the cockpit and the wheels so much further out in front of you that it really takes a lot to get your body weight so far forward that it's actually leveraging the bike into an endo, or even getting that feeling where that's gonna happen. I guess that's like a bigger consideration than even like going into a big crash, is like getting your weight further forward and then it feels like you're off balance over the front, and that's like a sketchy feeling. So the shorter wheelbase is definitely a bit of a handful to manage at speed. Things get rough, but there are some important lessons to be learned going back to a smaller bike when it comes to cornering. Front to rear center balance is something I've talked a lot about on this channel, and going back to smaller bikes like this is actually an important lesson in balance when it comes to front rear center ratios. So the chainstay on this bike is 435 millimeters, and you'll see that same chainstay measurement on modern bikes that have reaches and front centers that are massively bigger than this thing. So what that means is, in proportion to the front and rear end, the cranks and where your feet are actually more centered in between the wheels. And that's kind of represented with a ratio. And that's kind of how I judge a lot of bikes these days. It's a really good indication of how a bike rides with regards to where your weight bias is and how much weight is on the front wheel in a neutral riding position. So with this bike, it's got that short wheelbase, an average chainstay, but because the front is so short, the front to rear center ratio is 1.57. that is an incredibly tight ratio. Usually on bigger bikes these days, I look for something around 1.8, and some of the more unbalanced bikes that have a really short rear end and a really long front end, like the Pivot Firebird, those are like 1.9. But the fact that this is like a 1.56 just tells me that, yeah, my feet are really centered in between the rear wheels. It's just the distance that they're centered in between is very small. And how that shows up on the trail is in my neutral riding position, I have quite a bit of grip on the front wheel. Now, I think the caveat with it being so short is that it's easy to get thrown out of that happy place, but it's easy to find. And as long as you can keep it there, and kind of going back to what I was saying earlier, like, I think it just takes like a higher level of skill to like stay in that sweet spot, because there's not a lot helping you be there with the bike because it's not very stable. But if you're able to keep it there, the bike corners incredibly well. And I think that's where, you know, bikes got in this awkward place where they kept growing the reaches, the chainstays stayed the same. And it seems like just now in this latest generation of bikes, it's kind of becoming standard practice to grow the rear end in proportion to the front, and then achieving a similar amount of grip on the front wheel that you would have with a bike like this, with just a much safer and more appropriate wheelbase, in my opinion, for sizing these days. And then with the smaller wheels, I was able to flick this thing around like crazy. It seemed like I was able to just think of something and it happened. And that is obviously like a twitchier ride experience, but it does mean I could cut up into corners and place the bike super precisely and turn it on a dime, fit it in places that modern bikes don't really fit in. It's definitely an interesting experiment. I got into mountain bikes riding 26-inch trail bikes, and I do feel like I honestly felt like I learned to corner, you know, on these bikes, and I actually liked the way a lot of these bikes cornered. And then I think the like 2014, 2015, 2016 era of bikes and kind of moving into the modern realm, things got awkward where reaches got longer, chainstays stayed the same. And then now just recently, we're getting into bikes that have a bit more of a balanced geometry, and that's becoming a more important part of the conversation. And for me, that's brought a level of confidence into my cornering that I've honestly missed. And like going back to this bike, there's a lot of things that are a lot worse about it, but balanced cornering is actually not one of them. So the next thing we can touch on is the suspension. This has 160 millimeters in the rear, 160 mils up front. DW Link platform. Doesn't even look that much different to what Ibis is using right now, but how they have it tuned here, I think, is quite a departure from what we're used to seeing on modern bikes. Bikes in this era, I feel like, had a much bigger emphasis on pedaling and efficiency, and this bike pedals insanely well. But it definitely influenced how they tuned the leverage curve and anti-squat and everything going on with the suspension. And how that showed up is, I feel like the whole concept with bikes of this era was, you know, having a longer travel platform and really making it pedal well to make up for that longer travel. I think they wanted these things to pedal like XC bikes. So what it feels like they do with the suspension is have it be really firm off the top and then have it like kind of blow through its travel a little bit. So when you're climbing, you have a really good level of support, but then when something technical comes up, like the wheel kind of like moves out of the way, and then it kind of goes back to being like really efficient. The little bit of climbing I did on this, it kind of like reminded me of that feeling that I got on, you know, bikes of this era, where they don't feel like super plush off the top. They have like a really firm initial part of the travel, and then it kind of blows through, and then it's fairly linear through the rest of it. So that honestly works incredibly well for climbing, but it's almost the exact opposite of what you want for downhill performance, because it just means there's almost no small bump sensitivity, and then once you get into the big hits, it just blows through its travel. I made up for that by stuffing this shock with as many bands as I could find, and then running it really stiff. A lot of bikes these days, you can run like 30-35% sag. I was more closer to 25% on this with the compression in the middle setting for my race run. I think I just needed to do that to get the support out of the suspension that I needed, especially for the Sea Otter downhill. Like most modern bikes, you hop around in the parking lot and the suspension like gets into its travel easily. That first, 40-50% of the travel is really there to like add a lot of traction and comfort to the ride. And this, it feels drastically different. It feels like there's just so much emphasis on support in that initial part of the travel for pedaling efficiency that, yeah, it just doesn't, there's not that like cush feeling going into the travel. I could be completely off on that. The people who know more about the kinematics of these bikes can chime in the comments. And funny enough, I would almost say there's a similar characteristic to this fork. This is an X-Fusion sweep with the HLR damper. I was actually sponsored by X-Fusion back in the day, and these forks just don't have the same level of plushness that you expect out of, a modern enduro fork. And it's almost the same characteristic as the shock, where it's like kind of firm off the top, like a pretty bad level of small bump sensitivity. But then when you hit something, it just like blows through the travel. So, and again, the solution to fix that is like, all right, I'm gonna not even care about small bump sensitivity, and I'm just gonna make this fork as stiff as can be. So it seems like the air spring it performed decently for the Sea Otter downhill. It got the job done, but for everyday riding, like small bump sensitivity and the tune of the air spring leaves a lot to be desired. It's not to say suspension from this Aero was bad. One of my favorite forks of all time was a Fox Van 36 RC2 at 180 mils. And I think that was around maybe a little later, a few years later than this bike, but that fork was badass. So the technology was out there, just this isn't the best example of it. And I guess the last thing to touch on is the Mullet setup. I think the 27.5 front wheel definitely helped with rolling speed and just like, bigger wheel stuff, getting over holes and things, but I could definitely feel the 26-inch rear wheel like hanging up a lot more than I'm used to. But honestly, like from a geometry perspective, I almost didn't like the higher front end. And I think this is a bit of a hard thing to articulate. Like generally, I'm a fan of higher front ends, especially on modern bikes with longer reaches and longer chainstays. It just helps you get a little bit more leverage over the front end and give you a little bit more articulation with your upper body. But with the reach so short on this thing, I feel like, and me being really tall, it kind of has me a little over the back of the bike, and to get in that like sweet spot for cornering and just that neutral riding position, I kind of had to like consciously bring myself a little bit further forward. I would almost appreciate like a lower front end, and I have plenty of arm travel and articulation with my upper body because this thing's so short. So that's not a problem I'm trying to solve. It just felt like it was kind of stink bugged towards a rearward bias. But it was kind of a minor issue. I was still able to ride the bike and not have it like bother me too much. And generally this thing was super fun to ride. Definitely easy to get out of shape on. It scares me every once in a while, and it doesn't feel good to operate at a high level because it's just kind of sketchy, but you can do it. I think that's the thing I'm trying to say, is that it can be done. It's not making it a comfortable experience, and it takes a lot of skill to ride well, especially on more demanding terrain. The Sea Otter downhill wasn't super demanding, so it was kind of a fun experience, but I have ridden this bike on some harder stuff, and things do get hectic pretty quick. So I don't know, let me know what you guys think. Do you guys still have old bikes like this kicking around? what were some of your favorite 26-inch bikes. It was super fun riding this thing. It is for sale now, so holler at me. I'll give you a good deal, probably less than $1,000. So I don't know. Thanks for watching. Subscribe if you'd like. Check me out on Patreon. I've got some cool stuff over there that hasn't been released yet on my YouTube, and I'll catch you guys in the next video.